When my daughter walked down the aisle to marry a man who privately calls me a relic, I was not sitting in the front row. I was seated at table 17, tucked away in the darkest corner of the ballroom, right next to the swinging doors of the service kitchen. My own son walked her to the altar while I watched from the shadows like a ghost invited out of pity. They thought they were hiding their embarrassment. They thought I was just the retired sanitation worker with a pension that barely covered his rent. They had absolutely no idea that the $10 million fortune their mother left behind had already been moved to a trust they could not touch. That slap in the face was the moment I decided they would never see a dime of it. My name is Bernard Payne. I am 71 years old, and this is the story of how my children pushed me too far. The humiliation began the moment I stepped out of the taxi in front of the Plaza Hotel. I paused to adjust my tie in the reflection of the revolving brass doors. It was a charcoal gray suit, the fabric thinning at the elbows, and the style 2 decades out of date. It was the suit Etta, my late wife, had picked out for our 25th anniversary. She told me I looked like a king in it. Now standing under the gold awning of New York's most expensive venue, I looked like a relic. I moved toward the main entrance, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride for my daughter and the nervous anticipation of a father. "Excuse me, sir." A heavy hand landed on my shoulder before I could touch the handle. I turned to see a security guard, a young man with a headset and a look of practiced dismissal. He did not look me in the eye. He looked at my scuffed shoes and the fraying cuffs of my shirt. "Service entrance is around the back on 58th Street, he said, his voice flat. "Deliveries and staff do not use the main lobby." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a familiar burn I had known for 30 years while hauling trash bags from the curbs of wealthy neighborhoods. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy cream-colored envelope with gold calligraphy. "I am the father of the bride," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my hand trembled slightly. The guard blinked, looking from the invitation to my face and back again. He did not apologize. He simply stepped aside with a skeptical grunt, sweeping his hand toward the door, as if he were doing me a favor by letting me attend my own daughter's wedding. I walked into the lobby, the crystal chandeliers casting a light that felt too harsh for my tired eyes. I was inside, but I already knew I did not belong. I navigated through the crowd of guests. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. My daughter Nia had married into the Sterling family, old money from Connecticut, the kind of people who owned summer homes and horses. I saw Preston, my new son-in-law, laughing near the bar with his parents. They were radiant, holding crystal flutes of champagne, their teeth blindingly white. Preston looked right through me, his gaze sliding over my face as if I were part of the wallpaper. I approached the seating chart displayed on a gilded easel. I scanned the head table listed as the family. I saw Preston's parents, I saw his siblings. I even saw my son Dante and his wife Becky listed there. My name was missing. My heart hammered a painful rhythm against my ribs. I scanned down the list, past the cousins, past the college friends, past the business associates. Finally, I found it. Bernard Payne, table 17. I followed the numbers. Table 1 was center stage. Table 5 was near the dance floor. As the numbers climbed, the tables moved further into the periphery. I walked past the ice sculptures and the chocolate fountains until I reached the very edge of the room. Table 17 was a small, wobbly, round table shoved into a dark alcove. It was directly next to the double doors leading to the kitchen. Every time a server kicked the door open, a blast of hot, greasy air and the clatter of dishes hit me in the face. I was not sitting with family. I was sitting with the freelance photographer's assistant and 2 drivers who were waiting for their bosses. I sat down, placing my hands on my knees to stop them from shaking. I told myself it was a mistake. Naya must have overlooked it. She was stressed. Weddings are chaotic. But then the kitchen door swung open again, hitting the back of my chair with a thud. "Watch it," a voice hissed from behind me. A waiter, rushing with a tray of red wine glasses, tried to squeeze through the narrow gap between my chair and the wall. He stumbled. I felt the cold splash before I saw the stain. A glass tipped over, sending a cascade of dark crimson liquid down the left sleeve of my gray suit. Etta's favorite suit. "Oh God," the waiter muttered, not looking at me but at the velvet chair I was sitting on. I stood up, grabbing a napkin to dab at the fabric, watching the stains spread like fresh blood. A floor manager in a tuxedo materialized instantly. He did not look at me. He did not ask if I was wet or cold. He rushed to the chair, inspecting the upholstery with panic. "Get a towel for the velvet," the manager snapped at the waiter. "This is vintage fabric." "Sir," I said, my voice tight, "the wine is on my jacket." The manager glanced at me, his eyes flicking to the stain and then dismissing it as if the suit was already ruined before the wine touched it. "The restrooms are down the hall to the right," he said, turning his back to me to continue inspecting the chair. "You can clean yourself up there. Try not to drip on the carpet." I stood there, a 71-year-old man who had built a company from a single garbage truck into a waste management empire that I sold for 8 figures, being treated like a nuisance at my own child's celebration. I sat back down, the wet fabric chilling my skin. I would not leave. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. Then Preston appeared. He was walking his mother to her seat, looking every inch the golden boy Nia adored. He spotted me in the corner, dabbing at my sleeve. He stopped excusing himself from his mother and walked over. For a second I thought he was coming to apologize for the seating arrangement or the accident. "Bernie," he said, his voice lowered to a whisper. "He never called me Dad. He never called me Mr. Payne." It was always Bernie said, with a tone one might use for a slow child. "Look at you," he sighed, shaking his head. "You are making a mess already." "It was an accident, Preston," I said. The waiter bumped me. "Yeah, well, look," he interrupted, glancing nervously toward the main floor where the videographers were setting up their lights. "We are about to start the speeches and the first dances. The camera crew is going to be doing sweeps of the room." He gestured vaguely at my stained suit, my old tie, my very presence. "You stick out, Bernie. The aesthetic we went for is very specific. Black tie, elegant. This," he pointed a manicured finger at my chest, "is distracting. Do me a favor and just stay put. Okay?" He raised his hand and snapped his fingers at a passing staff member. "Hey, can we get this divider moved?" He pointed to a heavy velvet partition used to hide the service stations. "Just pull it out a bit. Angle it right here. Perfect." The staff member dragged the heavy curtain, positioning it so that it blocked the view of table 17 from the rest of the ballroom. I was literally being walled off. "Thanks, Bernie," Preston said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Just enjoy the food. The chicken is great." He turned on his heel and walked back into the light, leaving me in the shadow of the velvet curtain. The sounds of the party became muffled. I was at my daughter's wedding, but I might as well have been back in the alleyways of the Bronx, invisible, working in the dark, so others could live in the light. I looked down at my hands. These hands had calluses that never fully faded. They had lifted thousands of tons of trash so that Nia could have piano lessons. They had gripped a steering wheel for 16 hours a day so Dante could have brand new sneakers. Etta and I had saved every dollar, living in the same small row house in Queens, driving the same beat-up Ford, hiding our wealth, because we wanted our children to build their own character, not live off ours. I reached into my inner pocket, past the wine stain, and touched the small leather notebook where I kept the account numbers. $10 million. It was supposed to be their surprise, a legacy to lift them up when they were ready. But as I sat behind that curtain, listening to the muffled applause as my son Dante, who hadn't called me in 6 months, took the microphone to toast a man who had just hidden his father like a dirty secret, something inside me shifted. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. They saw a poor, useless old man. They saw a burden. They saw someone who could be silenced with a curtain and a plate of chicken. I took out my phone. I had one unread message from Mr. Rothstein, my lawyer, asking if I wanted to proceed with the trust fund transfer as a wedding gift. I typed a single line: "Freeze everything. We need to talk." I hit send. The screen went dark. I picked up my fork and began to eat. The chicken was dry, but the realization that I held their future in my hands tasted sweeter than any wine. They wanted me invisible. Fine. I would be the invisible force that pulled the rug out from under their entire world, and I would start by watching them celebrate a fortune they had already lost. The string quartet began to play a melody that Etta used to hum in the kitchen, a song about everlasting love that now sounded like a funeral dirge to my ears. The heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open, and the hush that fell over the crowd was immediate and reverent. I instinctively buttoned my stained charcoal jacket and stood up, my knees popping with the effort. This was the moment. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet partition Preston had used to hide me, preparing to walk toward the center aisle. I had rehearsed this walk in my mind for 30 years, ever since I held Nia in the delivery room. I was ready to give her away, to place her hand in her husband's, and to whisper that her mother was watching. But no one called my name. No one waved me forward. Instead, I watched in paralyzed silence as my son Dante stepped out from the front row. He looked sharp in a tuxedo I knew for a fact he could not afford standing exactly where I should have been. He offered his arm to his sister. My breath hitched in my throat. They had not just hidden me in the shadows, they had replaced me entirely. I stood there a foolish old man half emerged from a curtain waiting for someone to realize the mistake. I waited for Nia to stop and ask where her father was. But the guests did not turn to the back. Their eyes were fixed on the young beautiful people walking into the light. I was just a smudge in the peripheral vision of the help watching my son steal the one duty I had left. I sank back into my chair, the wood groaning under my weight, and realized I was not a guest of honor. I was a ghost they were hoping would simply fade away. Nia looked breathtaking as she moved through the room. She wore a dress that cost more than the down payment on the first house Etta and I bought in Queens, the silk trailing behind her like a cloud. As she glided past the outer tables navigating the path toward the altar, she came within 10 feet of my secluded corner. I sat up straighter, ignoring the wine dampening my arm. I told myself she had been forced into this arrangement by Preston's family. I told myself she was looking for me. And for a fleeting heartbeat, she did turn her head. Her eyes found mine behind the velvet rope. Time seemed to suspend in the heavy, perfumed air. I straightened my spine and offered her the soft, proud smile I had given her after her first piano recital, the same smile I gave her when she graduated college. I waited for a nod, a wink, a tear, anything that acknowledged I was her father. But the recognition in her eyes vanished as quickly as it appeared. It was replaced by a look of sheer indifference. She did not smile back. She snapped her head forward, pivoting her gaze toward the front table. I watched her face light up with a radiant, practiced joy as she locked eyes with Preston's parents. She beamed at the wealthy white couple who had never changed a diaper, never worked a double shift to buy her a violin, and never held her while she cried over a broken heart. She gave them the adoration that belonged to me. That single second of rejection cut deeper than 30 years of hauling garbage ever could. She had chosen her audience, and I was not part of it. The ceremony ended with applause that sounded like thunder, but I remained seated, my hands clenched into fists on my lap. Waiters began circling with champagne flutes, ignoring table 17 as if we were invisible. I needed to do something. I needed to stand up and offer a blessing to prove I existed, even if they didn't want me to. I stood up again, clearing my throat, intending to walk toward the head table. But before I could take 3 steps, a manicured hand slammed against my chest, stopping me cold. It was Becky, Dante's wife. She was holding a small plastic plate covered in aluminum foil. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my scuffed shoes with undisguised disgust. She asked me what I thought I was doing. I told her I wanted to offer a toast to the happy couple. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that caused a passing waiter to glance over. "Absolutely not," she hissed, stepping into my personal space to block my path. "Preston is terrified you will wander into the background of the videographer's shot. Look at you, Bernard. You look too country. You look like you belong in a soup kitchen, not at the plaza. You are ruining the aesthetic." She shoved the plastic plate into my hands hard enough to bend the rim. "Here," she said. "It is some appetizers the kitchen didn't use. Eat it quickly and go home before the speeches start. No one wants you here." She turned her back on me and walked away, smoothing her dress as if touching me had soiled her. I looked down at the cold food on the plastic plate. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, but it worked fine. I opened the chat with Mr. Rothstein. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second, trembling with a rage that had finally turned into ice. I typed 3 words: activate clause 13. I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered. I sat down and began to eat the cold appetizers. I would not leave. I would stay and watch. Because they thought the show was over, but they had no idea the real performance was just about to begin. The last guests were filtering out of the ballroom, leaving behind a landscape of stained tablecloths and half-eaten cake. I navigated through the maze of empty chairs toward the private VIP suite at the back of the venue where the family was gathering to collect the gifts. My legs felt heavy, not just from age, but from the weight of the small polished oak box I held in my calloused hands. I had crafted this box myself in my garage 30 years ago from a tree that fell in the backyard of the first home Etta and I bought. Inside lay the future I had built for my daughter. It contained a bank book with a testing balance of $5,000, but beneath the velvet lining sat the deed to that very house in Brooklyn, a property I had held on to through 3 decades of gentrification, now worth nearly $2 million. It was debt-free, renovated, and waiting for her signature. I reached the door of the suite and hesitated. Laughter rang out from inside, the sound of relief that the performance was over. I pushed the door open. Nia was sitting on a plush sofa, her shoes kicked off, massaging her feet while Dante poured more champagne. Preston was loosening his bow tie, his face flushed with alcohol and adrenaline. When I stepped in, the room went quiet. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and indifference. Nia looked up, her expression shifting from exhaustion to mild annoyance. She did not ask if I had enjoyed the wedding. She did not ask if I had eaten. She simply stared at the wooden box in my hands as if I were holding a dead rat. I walked forward, stopping just outside their circle of wealth. I told Nia that I had something for her. I told her that her mother wanted her to have this on the day she started her new life. I held the box out, my hands steady despite the tremor in my heart. It was not wrapped in silver paper or topped with a silk bow. It was just wood, simple and sturdy, much like the love I had tried to give her. Preston stood up, swaying slightly on his feet. He stepped between me and his wife, snatching the box from my grip with the entitlement of a man who has never been told no. He weighed it in his hands, a smirk playing on his lips. He asked if it was a clock or perhaps some antique junk I had dug out of the attic. He flicked the latch open with his thumb. The lid creaked, a sound that reminded me of home. He peered inside and let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter. He reached in and pulled out the old blue savings passbook I had placed on top. He flipped it open, scanning the balance I had printed there just yesterday. $5,000. He stared at the number, then looked at me, then back at the book. He started to chuckle, a low, mocking sound that quickly escalated into a roar. He waved the passbook in the air like a trophy of my failure. He called out to his groomsmen who were lingering by the bar. He told them to come look at the dowry of the century. He shouted that his father-in-law had really broken the bank this time, $5,000. He asked if that was enough to cover the flowers for the head table. He asked if it was meant to buy them a tank of gas for the limousine. The groomsmen laughed, clinking their glasses. One of them made a joke about buying a used Honda. I stood there frozen, watching them pass the book around like a comic strip. They did not look under the lining. They did not see the deed. They did not see the $2 million. They only saw the $5,000, and to them it was an insult. To me, $5,000 was once a fortune. It was the money that saved us when Dante needed surgery. It was the money that fixed the roof during the blizzard of '96. But to Preston, it was a punchline. Nia stood up, her face flushed not with anger at her husband, but with shame at me. She snatched the passbook from Preston's hand, but she did not defend me. She looked at me with eyes that were cold and hard. She asked me why I had to embarrass her. She asked me if I had any idea how much this wedding cost. She hissed that $5,000 was pathetic. She pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded to know why I was hoarding that old rotting house in the city. She screamed that I should have sold that shack years ago if I wanted to give her a real gift. She told me I was selfish for sitting on a property that was falling apart while she was trying to build a future. She called my home the home where she took her first steps a shack. She had no idea I had renovated the interior with marble and hardwood floors over the last 5 years. She had no idea it was a palace inside a rough shell. She threw the passbook back into the box with a violent thud. Preston grabbed the box from her. He looked at me with pure disdain. He said they didn't need my charity. He walked over to the large industrial trash can in the corner of the suite, the one filled with used napkins and empty bottles. He held the box over the opening. He looked me in the eye, daring me to speak. Then he dropped it. The heavy thud of the oak hitting the bottom of the bin echoed in the silent room. It sounded like a gavel coming down on a death sentence. I looked at the trash can, then I looked at my daughter. She turned her back to me, picking up her glass of champagne. I walked over to the bin. I reached down past the filth and retrieved the box. I wiped a smear of frosting off the lid with my sleeve. I checked the lining. The deed was still safe. I closed the latch. I looked at Nia's back one last time. I asked her if she was sure. She didn't turn around. She just waved her hand over her shoulder and told me to go home before the buses stopped running. I put the box under my arm. I turned and walked out the service door into the cold night air. They had thrown away $2 million, but more importantly, they had thrown away their father, and they would never get either back. I was tending to the hydrangeas Etta planted 40 years ago when the screech of tires shattered the morning peace. Dante drove his silver Lexus up onto the curb, the heavy wheels crushing the grass I trimmed by hand every Saturday. They did not park on the street like guests. They parked on the lawn like owners coming to inspect a demolition site. My son Dante stepped out of the driver's side, adjusting his sunglasses, while his wife Becky emerged from the passenger seat. They did not walk up the paved path. They cut straight across the flower bed. I watched in silence as Becky's red stiletto heels sank into the soft earth, snapping the stems of the purple blooms my wife had loved more than anything. She did not look down. She did not apologize. She marched toward the front door with the entitlement of a landlord evicting a squatter. They did not knock. They did not ring the bell. They simply turned the handle and walked into my sanctuary. I followed them inside, wiping the garden soil from my hands onto my trousers, feeling the dirt grit under my fingernails. They were standing in the center of the living room, their eyes scanning the space with sneers of disgust. Becky ran a finger along the oak mantelpiece and inspected it for dust. Dante yanked open the blinds, letting harsh sunlight flood the room and fade the vintage rugs Etta had chosen. They did not say hello. They did not ask how I was. They looked at me like a broken appliance that was taking up too much space. Becky dropped a heavy leather portfolio onto the dining table with a thud that rattled the china in the cabinet. She pulled out a chair and tapped a manicured fingernail on the wood, signaling for me to sit. It was not an invitation. It was a command. I sat opposite her, keeping my back straight, while Dante stood behind her with his arms crossed like a prison guard blocking the exit. Becky slid a stack of legal documents toward me. The bold letters at the top read, "Power of Attorney for Real Estate Transactions." She uncapped a sleek black pen and pointed the tip at the signature line. She told me to sign. She said Preston had called in a favor with a developer friend. She said they had found a facility for me. She called it a facility, not a home. She said it was in the Bronx, very affordable and efficient. She said I would be in a room with 3 other men. She said living alone in a 3-story brownstone was ridiculous for a man of my age. She said I was rattling around like a pea in a drum. She said the property value in this gentrifying neighborhood had skyrocketed, and it was a sin to let such an asset sit stagnant. She explained that the money from the sale would be split 3 ways. 1 small share would go to the nursing facility to cover my basic existence until I passed. The rest would go to Dante and Nia for immediate investment opportunities. She spoke about my life as if it were a business liquidation. She spoke about my home as if it were just a pile of bricks blocking her payday. I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen. I looked at the woman my son had married, a woman who saw a shared room in a state facility as an upgrade for the man who had raised her husband. I pushed the papers back across the table with a gentle hand. I told them I was not going anywhere. I told them this was my home. I told them Etta remained in these walls, and I would stay here until I joined her. Dante's face turned a dark, ugly shade of purple. He slammed his fist onto the table hard enough to make the wood groan. He shouted at me. He told me to stop being selfish. He screamed that I was hoarding wealth I could not even use. He said I was going to die soon anyway. He said it did not matter if I gave the house to them now or in 5 years because the result was the same. He said they needed the capital now to build their empire. He said holding on to the house was an act of spite. He looked at me with eyes devoid of love, devoid of respect, devoid of humanity. He did not see a father. He saw a walking corpse that was taking too long to lie down. He saw an obstacle to his inheritance. In that moment, the last thread of hope I held for my son snapped. He was not misguided. He was not stressed. He was waiting for me to die, and he was tired of waiting. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized I was already dead to them. I was just a ghost haunting a house they wanted to sell. I looked down at the table to hide the fire in my eyes. I told them I needed time to think. I told them I was tired, but inside my mind was sharpening like a blade. They wanted me to be a helpless old man. Fine, I would play the part. And while they watched the performance, I would rewrite the ending of their script. I sat at the dining table with the legal documents spread out before me like a map of my own destruction. Dante thrust the pen into my hand again, his grip tight and impatient. He told me to just sign the line at the bottom and stop wasting everyone's time. He said the nursing home in the Bronx had a waiting list, and I needed to secure my spot before I lost it. I looked at the black ink of the pen and then at the white paper that would sign away the rights to the home I had bought with sweat and blood. I knew I could not refuse them outright. If I said no again, they might get violent, or worse, they might try to forge my signature later when I was not looking. I needed to play the part they had already written for me. I needed to be the confused, frail old man they believed I was. I let my hand tremble. It started as a subtle vibration in my fingers and then escalated into a rhythmic shaking that rattled the pen against the table surface. Becky let out a loud, exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. I looked up at her with wide, watery eyes and apologized in a stammering voice. I told them my nerves were bad today. I told them my hands just wouldn't listen to me anymore. I reached out with my other hand to grab my mug of lukewarm coffee, intending to take a sip to steady myself. I timed it perfectly. As my fingers wrapped around the ceramic handle, I let my wrist spasm. The mug tipped over. Dark, cold liquid surged across the table, soaking the power of attorney documents instantly. The coffee pooled over the legal jargon, turning the crisp white pages into a brown, soggy mess. Becky shrieked and jumped back frantically, brushing at her skirt to avoid the splash. She screamed that I was clumsy and useless. She yelled that those papers cost money to draw up. I shrank back in my chair, pulling my hands to my chest, looking for all the world like a terrified child who had just wet the bed. I muttered apologies, telling them I didn't mean to, telling them I was just so clumsy lately. Dante snatched the dripping papers off the table, cursing under his breath. He threw them into the trash and looked at me with pure contempt. He told me I was a mess. He told me I was losing my mind. While Becky went to the kitchen to find paper towels, complaining loudly about the state of my countertops, Dante stepped away from the table. He pulled his phone from his pocket, turning his back to me as he walked toward the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. He thought I was busy wiping up the coffee with my sleeve, lost in my own confusion. He did not know that the glass of the patio door, backed by the dark shade of the oak tree outside, acted as a perfect mirror. I continued to dab at the table with a trembling hand, but my eyes were sharp and focused on the reflection. I watched him unlock his phone and open his messaging app. I saw him select Nia's contact. His thumbs moved rapidly across the screen, a smirk playing on his lips. I focused on the reflection of the text, reading the letters backward, but translating them instantly in my mind. The message was short and brutal. The old man is losing it completely. He is shaking like a leaf. This is going to be an easy mark. We will just print new papers tomorrow. I watched him hit send. I watched him chuckle to himself. That text was the final confirmation I needed. Nia was not just a bystander. She was waiting for the update. She was waiting to hear that her father had been conquered. My own children were not discussing my health or my well-being. They were discussing me like a predator discusses a wounded animal. They were celebrating my decline because it meant their payday was approaching. I lowered my head as Dante turned back around, hiding the cold fury in my eyes behind a mask of shame. I let them believe they had won the psychological battle. I let them believe I was broken. Dante told me they were leaving to get fresh copies of the documents and that they would be back the next day. He warned me not to make a mess of the house while they were gone. He spoke to me as if I were an unruly toddler. They walked out the front door, Becky still complaining about the smell of old coffee. I watched through the window as the silver Lexus backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. The moment the car was out of sight, I stood up. The tremor in my hands vanished instantly. My posture straightened. I walked to the front door and locked it, sliding the deadbolt into place. Then I turned and walked to the door under the staircase, the one my children thought led to a closet full of winter coats and old vacuum cleaners. I pushed aside the rack of heavy wool jackets and pressed my hand against the back panel of the wall. The biometric scanner read my palm print, and the panel clicked open, revealing a steel door. I entered my sanctuary. This was not a dusty storage space. It was a climate-controlled server room hummed by the sound of cooling fans and the blinking lights of my security mainframe. I sat down in my leather ergonomic chair and woke up the monitors. I had installed this system 5 years ago when I sold my waste management company, ensuring that my wealth and my data were secure. I typed in a command code and brought up the audio feed from the tracker I had magnetically attached to the undercarriage of Dante's Lexus a month ago when he came to borrow money for tires. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and adjusted the volume. The audio crackled to life. I could hear the hum of the engine and the soft whir of the air conditioning. And then, clear as a bell, I heard the voices of my son and his wife. They thought they were alone in their private bubble. They thought their secrets were safe. They had no idea that the senile old man they had just mocked was sitting in a high-tech bunker listening to every word they said. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes fixed on the audio waveforms dancing on the screen. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for them to walk right into it. I adjusted the noise-canceling headphones over my ears, blocking out the hum of the server room cooling fans. The audio feed from the bug I had planted on the chassis of Dante's Lexus hissed with static before settling into the steady rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching the digital waveform spike as Becky began to speak. Her voice was shrill, distorted slightly by the transmission, but unmistakable in its venom. She was complaining about the smell of my home. She said it smelled like decay. She said it smelled like old medicine and mothballs. She told Dante she had to burn her clothes just to get the scent of failure off her skin. I sat there in my ergonomic chair, surrounded by millions of dollars of state-of-the-art technology, listening to my daughter-in-law reduce my life to a stench. I remembered the smell of Dante's room when he was a teenager, a mix of sweat and dirty socks that I cleaned without complaint. I remembered the smell of Becky's perfume the first time she came to dinner, a scent that tried too hard to mask the emptiness inside her. Now she was talking about me as if I were a stain on her existence. I did not flinch. I did not take the headphones off. I needed to hear every word. I needed to let the poison enter my system so I could build the antidote. The car hit a pothole and I heard the suspension creak. Dante mumbled an agreement, adding that the whole place needed to be gutted. He said the only thing of value in that house was the land it sat on. He said I was just a squatter in their future fortune. I typed a command into the console, saving the audio file. This was not just insults. This was evidence. The conversation in the car shifted from insults to arithmetic. I watched the audio levels jump as Becky's voice grew excited. She started dividing up the spoils of a war they thought they had already won. She estimated the quick sale value of my brownstone at $800,000. It was a low-ball figure, a desperate number for desperate people, but they did not care about market value. They cared about speed. Becky staked her claim first. She told Dante she was taking $50,000 off the top. She said she deserved a reward for dealing with me. She said she wanted plastic surgery. She wanted to fix her body to match the lifestyle she felt she was owed. She spoke about silicone and lift procedures with the same casual greed one might use to order a sandwich. Then Dante spoke up. His voice was tighter laced with a panic he tried to mask as bravado. He said he needed $200,000 immediately. He mentioned a bookie in Jersey. He mentioned sports bets that had gone wrong. He said if he did not pay by the end of the month, people were going to start breaking legs. I listened as my son admitted to gambling away a fortune he did not even possess yet. But the true dagger came next. Becky asked about Nia. She asked what they should tell Dante's sister. Dante laughed a cold, barking sound. He said they would tell Nia the house sold for half its value. He said they would tell her the nursing home fees ate up the rest. He said Nia was too busy playing house with her rich white husband to notice the difference. He proposed cutting his own sister out of her share completely. Becky agreed instantly. Then Dante said it. He called me a filthy old man who had lived too long. He said I was a waste of space that should have been flushed years ago. He dehumanized me completely. He stripped away my fatherhood and left only a caricature of a dirty sanitation worker. I sat in the cool blue light of the monitors, feeling the final vestiges of paternal affection wither and die. They were not just greedy. They were predators feasting on a carcass that was not even dead yet. I minimized the audio window and opened a secure browser. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I had taught myself cybersecurity and forensic accounting during the long nights after Etta passed. It was a way to keep my mind sharp, a way to manage the empire I had built in the shadows. I navigated to the credit bureau database. I had Dante's social security number memorized. I was the one who filled out the application for his card when he was born. I punched in the digits and bypassed the security questions with the answers only a father would know. The credit report loaded a sprawling list of red flags and missed payments. I scrolled past the maxed-out credit cards and the defaulted car loans. I was looking for something specific. I found it near the bottom of the list. A hard inquiry from a lending agency I did not recognize, followed by a secured loan for $50,000 issued 3 weeks ago. I clicked on the details. The lender was a shell company, a front for the kind of loan sharks who operate out of basement offices in Queens. But it was the collateral that made my blood run cold. Listed under the secured assets was the deed to my home. I clicked further to view the scanned application documents. There, at the bottom of the page, was my signature. It was a clumsy forgery, a shaky attempt to mimic the hand that had signed Dante's report cards and birthday checks. My son had stolen my identity. He had leveraged the roof over my head to pay for his vices. He had put a target on my back. If he defaulted, those men would come for my house. They would come for me. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a felony. I printed the document. The printer whirred in the silence of the room, spitting out the proof of my son's crime. I picked up the warm paper. I looked at the fake signature. I realized Dante had not just betrayed me emotionally. He had endangered my life. I placed the paper in a fresh file folder. The time for listening was over. It was time to start closing doors. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor of the Obsidian Tower was smooth and silent, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning in my stomach. Nia had sent a text message earlier that day inviting me to dinner. It was the first time she had reached out since the wedding disaster. I wanted to believe it was an olive branch. I wanted to believe my little girl missed her father. But as the steel doors slid open to reveal the sterile marble foyer of the apartment she shared with Preston, I knew better. The air smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition. I stepped inside, clutching my hat in my hands. The living room was vast with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was a view meant to impress, meant to signal power. Preston was standing by the glass, his back to me. He was wearing a silk smoking jacket that looked ridiculous on a man of 30. In one hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. He did not turn around when I entered. He did not greet me. He simply took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch until it became an insult. Nia was sitting on a white leather sofa, her legs crossed, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up at me for a second, her expression unreadable before looking back down at the screen. There was no dinner table set. There were no smells of cooking food. There was only a low glass coffee table in the center of the room, and on it sat a single thick stack of legal documents. I remained standing in the entryway. No one offered to take my coat. No one offered me a glass of water. No one offered me a seat. I was 71 years old, a man who had spent his life hauling the city's refuse, so these two could live in a cloud, and they left me standing like a servant waiting for instructions. Preston finally turned around. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy with the glaze of premium scotch. He walked over to the coffee table and picked up the documents. He dropped them back down with a heavy thud. He looked at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He told me to come over there. He did not ask. He commanded. I walked slowly across the marble floor, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. I stood before him, keeping my posture stooped, my eyes lowered. I needed them to keep underestimating me. Preston gestured to the papers. He told me he had a business proposition. He said he was going to launch a chain of elite fitness centers. He used words like synergy and disruption. He talked about market caps and return on investment. He spoke fast, using jargon he clearly barely understood, trying to dazzle the simple garbage man. Then he got to the point. He needed capital. He said traditional lenders were too slow and lacked vision. He said he needed a bridge loan to secure the prime locations. He pointed a finger at me. He said my house was dead capital. He said it was just sitting there rotting, doing nothing for the family. He told me it was time for me to contribute. I looked down at the papers. It was a second mortgage application, a lien against the deed to my home. The terms were predatory. If he missed a single payment, the lender would seize the property. My property. Preston reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black ink pad. He uncapped it and placed it next to the signature line. He did not offer me a pen. He looked at me with a sneer that revealed the depth of his prejudice. He told me to just press my thumb right there. He said it was easier than signing. He spoke to me as if I were illiterate, as if I were a man who could not read or write his own name. The insult was so sharp, so direct, it almost took my breath away. I had signed contracts for millions of dollars. I had negotiated deals with unions and city councils. And this boy, this man who had never worked a day of hard labor in his life, was treating me like cattle. I hesitated. I looked at Nia. I waited for her to speak up. I waited for her to tell her husband that her father was an educated man, a man of dignity. She did not look up from her phone. Preston stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of alcohol on his breath was overpowering. He lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. He told me I had no choice. He told me that if I wanted to be part of this family, I had to pay my dues. Then he played his final card. He told me that they were planning to start a family soon. He said that if I did not help them now, if I did not secure their future, I should not expect to ever see my grandchildren. He said he would make sure I died alone, without a legacy, without family. He threatened the one thing I had left to lose, the unborn generation. He held my future hostage for the price of a gym franchise. Rage, hot and blinding, flared in my chest. But I forced it down. I needed to maintain the charade. I needed to be the clumsy, helpless old man one last time. I reached out a trembling hand toward the document. I feigned a look of confusion and fear. I mumbled that I didn't understand. I reached for the ink pad, letting my hand shake violently. As my fingers grazed the edge of the open container, I jerked my wrist. The pad flipped. It launched into the air and landed face down directly in the center of the mortgage document. Black, permanent ink exploded across the page, soaking into the fibers, obliterating the terms, ruining the contract instantly. I gasped, bringing my hands to my mouth in mock horror. I stammered an apology. I said my hands were no good anymore. I said I was sorry. Preston stared at the ruined paper. His face turned a deep, violent shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged. He let out a roar of pure, unadulterated fury. He did not think. He reacted. He swung his hand back and struck me. The slap was hard. It caught me square on the cheek, snapping my head to the side. The sound of flesh hitting flesh cracked through the silent apartment like a gunshot. My glasses flew off my face and skittered across the marble floor. I stumbled back, clutching my face, tasting blood on the inside of my lip. The physical pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the coldness that washed over me. I froze, waiting. I waited for the scream. I waited for Nia to jump up. I waited for her to rush to my side, to push her husband away, to demand how he dared touch her father. I waited for the outrage. But the room remained silent. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head to look at my daughter. Nia was standing now. She had put her phone down. She was looking at us. She looked at Preston, whose chest was heaving with rage. Then she looked at me, holding my swelling cheek. She did not move toward me. She did not speak. She simply turned her head and looked out the window at the city lights. She smoothed her dress and picked up her glass of water, taking a sip as if she were watching a boring commercial. She chose to be blind. She chose to be deaf. In that silence, in the turn of her head, she severed the last tie between us. Preston had hit me, but Nia had delivered the killing blow. I looked at them, the ink soaking into the table, my glasses lying broken in the corner. I straightened my back. I did not pick up my glasses. I did not say a word. I turned and walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. As the doors closed, cutting off the view of the daughter who had just watched her husband assault me, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It was the last tear I would ever shed for them. The time for mercy was over. The time for payment had begun. I returned to the brownstone that night, the silence of the empty halls pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The house felt different now. It was no longer a sanctuary of memories, but a crime scene where my heart had been murdered by my own flesh and blood. I walked straight to the master bedroom, the room I had not slept in since Etta passed. The air still carried the faint, ghostly scent of her lavender lotion. I knelt beside the heavy oak wardrobe and pulled up the loose floorboard in the corner, revealing the small fireproof safe bolted to the joists. My fingers spun the dial, the combination etched into my muscle memory. The heavy door swung open. Inside lay the deed to the penthouse, the stock certificates, and the leather-bound ledger of the trust fund. But I reached past those. I pulled out a worn burgundy diary with gold-gilded pages, Etta's diary. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under my weight, and ran my hand over the cover. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from the phantom pain of the night my life actually ended. Everyone thought Etta died peacefully in her sleep, her heart simply giving out after 65 years of love and labor. That was the lie I told the world to protect my children. That was the lie I told to protect Dante. I opened the book to the last entry dated 9 years ago. The ink was smeared in places, evidence of the tears she had shed while writing it. I read the words I had memorized 1,000 times, letting the memory of that terrible Tuesday wash over me. It was raining that night, a cold, relentless November rain that battered the windows. Etta had been the treasurer for the Greater Hope Baptist Church for 15 years. She took pride in every penny raised for the soup kitchen and the scholarship fund. She was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by receipts and bank statements. her brow furrowed in confusion that slowly turned to horror. I was in the living room reading the paper when I heard her gasp. It was a sound of pure physical pain. I rushed in to find her clutching her chest, her other hand gripping a stack of withdrawal slips. She looked at me, her eyes wide with betrayal, and whispered Dante's name. She had found the discrepancy. Over 6 months, $10,000 had been siphoned from the church accounts. The signature on the withdrawals was a clumsy forgery of hers, but the surveillance photos the bank had sent with the statement showed our son at the teller window. Dante had stolen from God. He had stolen from the poor to pay for his first failed business venture and a sports car he crashed 3 weeks later. Etta tried to stand up to call him to demand an answer, but the stress was too much. Her heart, already weakened by years of silent worry over our children's selfishness, seized. I caught her as she fell. I held her on the linoleum floor as the life drained from her eyes. She grabbed my collar with a strength that frightened me. She made me swear. She told me about the patent money. Years ago, she had invested her small savings in a friend's hair care invention, a formula for natural hair that exploded in the market. She had quietly amassed a fortune, reinvesting every dime, building a legacy of $10 million she planned to surprise them with at Christmas. But in that moment, dying on the kitchen floor, she saw the truth. Money would not help them. Money would destroy them. She made me promise to hide it. She made me vow to lock it away until they learned the value of $1, until they learned integrity. Hide it, Bernie, she gasped. Don't let them have it until they are good. Then she was gone. I closed the diary, the leather warm against my skin. I had kept that promise for 9 years. I had watched them struggle, hoping the struggle would build character. I had watched them stumble, hoping the falls would teach them humility. I lived like a pauper, hoarding millions, waiting for a sign of redemption that never came. Instead of growing, they rotted. Dante did not learn from the church theft. He just got better at hiding his tracks until he started stealing from me. Nia did not learn to value family. She learned to value status. They had not become good. They had become monsters who mocked their father and plotted to put him in a grave so they could pick his pockets. I looked at the framed photograph on the nightstand. It was the last picture taken of the 4 of us, smiling on the porch the summer before Etta died. We looked happy. We looked like a family. But it was a lie even then. Dante was already stealing. Nia was already ashamed of us. Etta and I were the only ones who believed the smile. I took the photo out of the frame. I walked to the fireplace in the living room where the cold ashes of last winter still sat in the grate. I struck a match. The flame flared bright and hungry. I held the corner of the photograph to the fire. I watched the faces of my children curl and blacken. I watched the image of the family we pretended to be turn into smoke and ash. Tears streamed down my face, hot and stinging. I was not crying for Dante or Nia. I was not crying for myself. I was crying for Etta. I was crying because I had to break my promise to her. I could not wait for them to be good anymore. They had proven that goodness was not in their nature. The time for waiting was over. The vow was broken not by me but by their cruelty. Etta wanted to teach them a lesson. She wanted them to learn. Well, I would teach them. But it would not be the gentle lesson of a mother. It would be the harsh, unforgiving lesson of a father who has nothing left to lose. I dropped the burning photo into the grate and watched it crumble. I took out my phone and dialed Mr. Rothstein. It was time to stop protecting them. It was time to start the punishment. Becky drove us to the discount warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of place where the air smells like cardboard and the fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry hornets. She pushed the shopping cart with an aggressive speed, forcing me to limp behind her to keep up my bad knee aching with every rapid step she took. She told me we needed to stock up on essentials for my transition to the facility in the Bronx. She threw in bulk packs of generic adult diapers, even though I have never suffered from incontinence in my life, claiming it was better to be safe than sorry. She tossed in dented cans of sodium-rich soup that were close to their expiration date, telling me that old people lose their sense of taste anyway, so the quality did not matter. It was humiliating to watch her treat the cart like a trash can for my dignity. But then we moved to the cosmetics aisle, and her demeanor changed completely. She slowed down. She carefully selected a jar of organic night cream that cost $50. She added a bottle of imported champagne and a package of premium filet mignon, explaining that she and Dante needed to celebrate his big win, which I knew for a fact was just a loan shark payment he had barely scraped together. She piled high-end hair products and gourmet chocolates on top of the cheap polyester tracksuits she had picked out for me because she said zippers were easier for arthritic hands. She was not shopping for a father who had supported her husband for years. She was shopping for a prisoner she was about to lock away. I watched her place a magazine featuring luxury homes on top of the pile. She was already planning her next life, a life funded by the sale of my home, while buying me the cheapest, most degrading supplies she could find. I said nothing. I let her fill the cart with her greed and my shame. I let her believe I was too confused to notice the difference between the slop she bought for me and the luxury she bought for herself. We reached the checkout lane, and the conveyor belt began to move, carrying the mountain of goods toward the scanner. The cashier, a tired woman with gray roots showing in her hair, scanned item after item. The total climbed higher and higher on the digital screen, fueled by Becky's luxury items rather than my survival rations. $300, $400, $500. When the cashier announced the final amount, Becky did not reach for her own wallet. She did not pull out cash from her purse. She pulled out the platinum credit card I had given Dante 5 years ago for emergencies. It was an emergency card they had used for sushi dinners, designer shoes, and weekends in Atlantic City. She swiped it with the arrogance of someone spending found money barely looking at the terminal. The machine let out a harsh buzzing sound. Declined. The cashier looked at the screen and then at Becky. "Please try again," the cashier said in a monotone voice. Becky huffed, rolling her eyes at me as if I had personally broken the machine. She swiped it again, harder this time, nearly snapping the plastic. Declined. A flush of red crept up her neck, staining her skin. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fury, not embarrassment. "You forgot to deposit the allowance," she hissed loud enough for the line of people behind us to hear. "You told Dante you put the money in the account yesterday." The cashier sighed and asked if she had another form of payment. Becky slammed her hand on the counter, causing the pack of gum near the register to rattle. "This is his fault," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "He is senile. He forgets to pay the bills. He is confused, and now he has embarrassed me. Call the bank right now, Bernard, and fix this." I stood there silent, watching the line of people grow impatient. They looked at me with pity, seeing a confused old man being berated by his daughter. I looked at the card in her hand. It was a piece of plastic I had powered for years, but as of 8 o'clock this morning, it was just a piece of plastic. I had frozen the assets. I stepped forward, moving with a grace and stability that belied the frail act I had perfected over the last few days. I reached past the pile of unpaid groceries, past the diapers and the cheap soup, and picked up a single pack of peppermint gum from the impulse rack. I placed it on the counter in front of the stunned cashier. I reached into the inside pocket of my worn tweed jacket and bypassed the few crumpled bills I carried. I pulled out a heavy black titanium card. The light caught the matte finish and the silver lettering. It was the Centurion card from American Express, the black card that is invitation only, the card that requires a spending history that would make Becky's head spin. I held it out. The cashier's eyes widened. She froze. She knew what that card was. She knew that card meant unlimited buying power. She took it with trembling fingers, treating it like a religious artifact. Becky gasped. The sound was sharp and wet, like she was choking on air. She had never seen that card. She did not know I had it. She did not know I qualified for it. She stared at the black metal rectangle as if it were a weapon. She reached for the cart, her hand hovering over the champagne, assuming I was stepping in to pay for everything as I always did. I stopped her with a look. It was not a look of confusion. It was a look of absolute cold clarity. Just the gum, I told the cashier, my voice deep and steady. Becky froze. "But the groceries," she stammered, her voice shrinking. "The champagne, my creams. We need these things." I took the receipt and my pack of gum. I slid the heavy black card back into my wallet. "This card does not pay for garbage," I said, looking directly into Becky's eyes. "It does not pay for disrespect, and it certainly does not pay for you." I turned my back on her. I walked toward the automatic doors without looking back. I heard the security guard asking Becky to step aside so other customers could pay. I heard her screaming my name, a shrill sound of panic and disbelief. I kept walking into the parking lot, inhaling the fresh air. I popped a piece of gum into my mouth. It tasted like victory. I left her there to explain to the manager why she had tried to buy $500 worth of merchandise with a dead card. I walked to the bus stop. I did not need a ride from her. I had my own way home, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I was going. The desperation in the air was so thick I could taste it like metal on my tongue. Dante and Preston did not wait for an invitation. They burst through my front door at 9 in the morning, their faces pale and their eyes darting around my living room with the frantic energy of men who owe money to dangerous people. They were not alone. Trailing behind them was a short man with a nervous tic in his left eye and a suit that looked like it had been slept in. He carried a battered leather medical bag and avoided looking directly at me. Dante did not ask how I was or why I had humiliated his wife at the supermarket yesterday. He went straight to the script they had clearly rehearsed in the car. He told me that my behavior at the store was the final straw. He said I was a danger to myself and others. He said I was clearly suffering from advanced dementia and that he could not live with himself if he let me wander the streets confusing credit cards and making scenes. Preston stood by the door blocking the exit, nodding in agreement with a solemnity that was almost comical. He introduced the stranger as Dr. Slate, a specialist in geriatric cognitive decline who had graciously agreed to make a house call on a Sunday. I sat in my armchair sipping my black coffee and watched them perform. I knew exactly what this was. The credit card rejection had terrified them. Without my money, the loan sharks would come for Dante's kneecaps and the creditors would seize Preston's gym equipment. They needed control of my assets immediately, and since I refused to sign the power of attorney, they were going to have me declared mentally incompetent by force. Dr. Slate sat opposite me, pulling a clipboard from his bag. He did not check my pulse. He did not look at my eyes. He simply uncapped his pen and looked at Dante for approval before starting. They thought they were trapping a confused old man. They had no idea they were sitting in a room with a man who had spent the last night memorizing the state medical codes. The doctor cleared his throat and asked me to state my full name and the current year. I placed my coffee cup on the coaster with a steady hand. I looked him in the eye. I told him my name was Bernard Payne, and the year was 2024. He scribbled something down, frowning as if I had gotten it wrong. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. It was a standard cognitive test, but the way he asked it was condescending, his tone dripping with bored arrogance. I recited the numbers flawlessly, my voice calm and deep. 93, 86, 79. I stopped at 72 and leaned forward. I asked him if he wanted me to continue to 0, or if we could skip to the part where he falsified the diagnosis. The doctor froze. His pen hovered over the paper. Dante stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. He told the doctor to ignore me. He said that paranoia was a classic symptom of the disease. He said I often made up stories about conspiracies. Dr. Slate nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. He asked me if I often felt that people were plotting against me. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. I told him that under the mental hygiene law of this state, a determination of incapacity requires clear and convincing evidence of functional limitations, not just the hearsay of a son with a gambling addiction. I cited the specific statute regarding the fiduciary responsibilities of a court-appointed guardian. I saw the doctor's eyes widen. He shifted in his seat. He was not expecting a legal lecture. I continued. I asked him about his board certification. I asked him why he was conducting a competency hearing in a living room without a court order or a second opinion. I used the precise medical terminology for cognitive assessment protocols. I dismantled his authority sentence by sentence. Preston looked at Dante with panic in his eyes. This was not part of the plan. They had hired a rubber stamp, not a debater. The doctor looked at his clipboard, his hand shaking slightly. He stammered that my aggression was another sign of frontal lobe deterioration. He tried to regain control, but I could smell his fear. He was a predator who had just realized he had walked into the den of a lion. Dr. Slate stood up abruptly. He tore the top sheet off his clipboard and held it out to Dante. He said he had seen enough. He said he was prepared to sign an emergency affidavit stating that I required immediate institutionalization for observation. He said my hostility was a danger to the family. Dante reached for the paper, a look of triumph washing over his face. He thought he had won. He thought he was seconds away from seizing my bank accounts. I did not move from my chair. I simply reached under the cushion and pulled out a thick manila folder I had prepared with Mr. Rothstein the night before. I threw it onto the coffee table. The heavy slap of the paper echoed in the silent room. I told the doctor to pick it up. He hesitated. I used my command voice, the voice that had directed hundreds of employees on the sanitation lines. I told him to read the first page. He picked it up slowly. His face drained of all color as his eyes scanned the document. It was a printout from the Medical Board of New Jersey. It detailed the revocation of a medical license belonging to a Dr. Morris Slate for insurance fraud and prescribing narcotics to dead patients. I stood up then, towering over him. I told him I knew he was not licensed to practice medicine in this state. I told him I knew he had changed his name 2 years ago to avoid a prison sentence. I pointed to the camera lens hidden in the smoke detector above us. I told him that every word of this illegal consultation had been recorded and uploaded to a cloud server my lawyer was monitoring. I gave him a choice. I told him he could leave my house in the next 10 seconds, or he could stay and explain his medical opinion to the police officers I was about to call. The doctor dropped the clipboard. He did not look at Dante. He did not ask for his fee. He turned and ran for the door, scrambling to get out as if the house were on fire. The front door slammed shut, leaving a vibrating silence in its wake. I looked at my son and my son-in-law. They stood there alone and exposed the fake affidavit lying on the floor between us. They looked at the folder. They looked at the camera. Then they looked at me. And for the first time, they did not see a senile old man. They saw the man who had just destroyed their last hope. I pointed to the door. "Get out!" It was Tuesday evening when I decided to execute the final test of their humanity. My children and their spouses had gathered in my living room once again, their voices rising in a cacophony of demands and threats. Dante was waving a fresh contract in my face, shouting about investment opportunities that were expiring at midnight. Becky was pacing by the window, complaining that my stubbornness was ruining their financial future. Nia sat on the sofa weeping softly, telling me that I was being difficult just to spite them. I looked at their faces, twisted by greed and impatience, and I knew I had to know the truth once and for all. I needed to know if there was a single drop of love left in this room, or if I was truly just a breathing ATM to them. I stood up from my armchair, clutching my chest with both hands. I let out a ragged, wet gasp, a sound I had practiced in the mirror for days. I grimaced, contorting my face into a mask of agony. I let my knees buckle beneath me. I hit the floor with a heavy, calculated thud, making sure to land safely but loudly enough to shake the floorboards. I curled onto my side on the Persian rug, one hand gripping the fabric, the other clutching my heart. I squeezed my eyes shut, regulating my breathing to shallow, desperate wheezes. I lay there helpless and prone, waiting for the panic. I waited for the rush of footsteps. I waited for someone to scream, "Dad." I heard Nia scream a sharp, high-pitched sound of genuine terror. I heard the rustle of fabric as she jumped up. I heard her fingers tapping frantically on her phone screen. She was dialing emergency services. But then a heavy hand slammed down on her wrist. It was Preston, his voice cut through the room, calm and terrifyingly logical. He told her to wait. He told her to hang up the phone. I lay there on the rug, my ear pressed against the wool, listening to my son-in-law negotiate the value of my life. He told Nia to look at me. He said it looked like a massive coronary event. He said if they called the ambulance now, the doctors might save me, but the damage would be catastrophic. He argued that I would come back as a vegetable, a burden that would require 24-hour care. He said long-term nursing would drain every penny of the estate within a year. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He said that if I died right here, right now, without a will, the assets would be divided evenly by morning, according to state law. He said it would be clean. He said it would be over. He said it was mercy. I waited for Nia to slap him. I waited for her to push him away and dial the 3 numbers that would save her father. But I heard nothing but her soft, choking sobs. She stood still. She let him hold her hand down. She chose the money over my breath. Then I felt hands on me. They were not checking for a pulse. They were not loosening my tie to help me breathe. They were rough, frantic hands digging into my jacket pockets. It was Dante. He was muttering to Becky. He said he needed the key to the floor safe before the coroner arrived. He was looting my body while he thought I was dying. He rolled me over, shoving his hand into my trouser pocket, indifferent to my suffering. He found the brass keyring. He whispered that he had it. Dante's fingers closed around the cold metal of the keys, and that was the moment the last ember of my fatherly love turned into absolute ash. I opened my eyes. I did not blink. I stared directly into Dante's greedy face, which was inches from mine. He froze. His eyes went wide with a primal terror as he realized the corpse was looking back at him. I reached out with my left hand, the hand that had lifted iron trash cans for 30 years. I clamped my fingers around his wrist. I squeezed until I felt his bones grind together. He yelped and tried to pull away, dropping the keys, but I held him fast. I sat up, the motion fluid and strong. I pushed him backward, sending him sprawling onto the floor next to his wife. I stood up. I did not use the table for support. I rose to my full height, straightening my jacket, brushing the lint from my lapels. The room went deadly silent. Nia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her face draining of all color. Preston took a step back, bumping into the wall, looking like he had seen a ghost. I looked at each of them in turn. I looked at the daughter who let me die for a payout. I looked at the son who robbed my pockets while I gasped for air. I looked at the in-laws who orchestrated the hit. My voice was not the voice of a sick old man. It was deep and resonant, filling the corners of the room with judgment. I told them I was not dead. I told them my heart was beating stronger than ever, but I pointed a finger at them and delivered the final verdict. I told them that, as of this moment, I was alive, but my children were the ones who were dead. The sun had barely risen when Dante and Becky pulled up to the brownstone, their car trunk filled with empty cardboard boxes and heavy-duty trash bags. They had come to pack my life away. They had come to strip the house of anything valuable before shipping me off to the facility in the Bronx. Dante marched up the steps, a set of master keys jingling in his hand, ready to override any lock I might have changed. He threw the front door open, prepared to shout, prepared to bully, prepared to drag his father out by the collar if necessary. But the shout died in his throat. The house was silent. It was not the quiet of a sleeping home. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a tomb. They stepped into the foyer and stopped dead. The house was empty. Completely, devastatingly empty. The antique coat rack was gone. The Persian runner in the hallway was gone. They walked into the living room, their footsteps booming on the bare hardwood floors. The furniture was gone. The curtains were gone. The bookshelves, usually groaning with decades of literature and encyclopedias, were stripped bare. Even the light bulbs had been unscrewed from the ceiling fixtures, leaving the room in a gray, early morning gloom. There was no note. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if I had simply evaporated into the ether, taking 40 years of history with me. Becky ran to the kitchen. The cupboards were open and bare. The refrigerator door stood ajar, revealing nothing but empty wire racks. She screamed my name, her voice bouncing off the empty walls, mocking her. They had come to evict a helpless old man, but the old man had evicted himself, and he had taken the soul of the house with him. Panic set in quickly, fueled by the terrifying realization that the asset they had already leveraged, the inheritance they had already spent in their minds, was vanishing before their eyes. Dante's eyes darted around the empty room, wild and bloodshot. He screamed that I must have hidden the money. He convinced himself that a senile old man would stuff cash into the walls or bury gold under the floorboards. He ran to the car and came back with a crowbar and a sledgehammer. He did not care about the resale value anymore. He cared about the immediate cash he needed to pay off the loan sharks. He swung the sledgehammer into the drywall of the living room. Plaster and dust exploded into the air. He tore at the lath, ripping open the veins of the house Etta and I had restored with our own hands. He found nothing but insulation and darkness. Becky joined in, using the crowbar to pry up the original oak floorboards in the dining room, convinced that the loose board I used for my safe was just the tip of the iceberg. She splintered the wood, ruining the finish, panting with exertion and greed. They moved from room to room like a swarm of locusts. They smashed the tile in the bathroom. They tore down the molding in the hallway. They ripped open the mattress in the guest room, filling the air with feathers. They destroyed the very thing they wanted to sell. The house, once a stately brownstone worth nearly $1 million, was rapidly becoming a pile of debris and broken dreams. They were sweating, covered in white dust, their hands bleeding from splinters, but they found nothing. No cash, no jewelry, no secret ledger. Just the hollow echo of their own madness. I had cleared the safe days ago. I had moved the assets. I had left them nothing but the dust of their own destruction. The vibration of Dante's phone against the hardwood floor cut through the sound of their demolition. It was lying amidst the rubble of the dining room. Dante dropped the sledgehammer and scrambled to answer it, hoping for good news, hoping for a lifeline. It was Preston. His voice was loud enough to be heard through the speaker, shrill and panicked. He did not ask how the eviction was going. He screamed that the joint account was dead. He had gone to the bank that morning to withdraw the operating capital for his gym, confident that my monthly pension deposit and the emergency funds were sitting there waiting for him. He told Dante the teller had laughed at him. The account had been closed. The balance was zero. Every cent of my pension, every dollar of the rainy day fund they thought they had access to, had been transferred out. Preston shouted that the checks he had written to contractors were bouncing. He shouted that the lease on their penthouse was in jeopardy. He demanded to know where I was. He demanded to know where the money was. Dante fell to his knees in the middle of the ruined living room. He looked at the holes in the walls. He looked at the splintered floor. He looked at his wife, who was sobbing into her hands, covered in plaster dust. They had destroyed the house to find a fortune that wasn't there, and now they realized the steady stream of income they relied on had dried up completely. They were standing in a wreck of their own making, broke, desperate, and alone. The old man wasn't just gone. He had taken the future with him. I sat in the high-backed leather chair of the penthouse study, a glass of vintage Cabernet resting on the mahogany desk. The room was silent, save for the hum of the climate control system that kept the air crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the dust-choked atmosphere I had left behind at the brownstone. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city skyline, a glittering expanse of lights that Etta and I had once admired from the street level. This apartment belonged to the trust Etta established decades ago, a secret sanctuary she had purchased as a hedge against the very greed that now consumed our children. I was not looking at the view, however. My eyes were fixed on the bank of high-definition monitors mounted on the wall. They displayed the live feed from the hidden cameras still active inside the hollow shell of my old home. I watched my family like a scientist observing a colony of rats that had turned on itself. The living room was a disaster zone of smashed drywall and splintered floorboards. Dante sat on a pile of debris, his head in his hands, while Becky paced back and forth, kicking at the rubble. Nia and Preston stood near the fireplace, the tension between them visible even through the pixelated screen. I took a sip of wine. It tasted rich and complex, unlike the cheap swill Preston had served at his apartment. I felt a strange, cold detachment. I was no longer their father. I was the judge, and the verdict had already been delivered. On the central monitor, the silent tension exploded into violence. Preston was shouting, his face contorted with rage. The audio feed picked up his voice, shrill and distorted by the echo of the empty room. He was screaming at Nia, blaming her for my disappearance, blaming her for the empty bank account. He accused her of knowing I was hiding money and keeping it from him. Nia was crying, her hands raised in a futile attempt to calm him down. She told him she didn't know. She begged him to stop. Preston didn't stop. He stepped forward and swung his hand. The slap knocked Nia sideways. She fell onto a pile of plaster dust, clutching her cheek, looking up at her husband with a mixture of shock and terror. I gripped the stem of my wine glass until my knuckles turned white. My instinct was to rush to her to protect my little girl. But then I remembered the wedding. I remembered her silence when Preston hit me. I remembered how she turned her head away. She had chosen this man. She had chosen his cruelty because it came wrapped in the promise of wealth. Now the wealth was gone, and only the cruelty remained. Across the room, the violence was contagious. Becky turned on Dante. She screamed that he was a liar and a failure. She yelled that she had wasted the best years of her life on a loser who couldn't even rob his own father correctly. She pulled her wedding ring off her finger and threw it at him. It bounced off his chest and disappeared into the debris. She demanded a divorce. She said she was leaving and taking whatever she could carry. Dante didn't fight back. He just sat there broken, staring at the floor. But the internal war was interrupted by an external threat. A heavy rhythmic pounding started at the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a battering. The loan sharks had come to collect. I saw Dante jump up, his eyes wide with panic. He knew who was on the other side of that door. He knew they weren't there to talk. They were there to break bones. The family that had united to destroy me was now trapped in the ruins of their own making, surrounded by enemies they had invited into their lives. I set the wine glass down on the coaster. The liquid settled dark and still. I had seen enough. The physical danger they were in was real, but it was a danger Dante had signed up for when he forged my signature. I could not save them from the wolves they had fed. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the number for Mr. Rothstein. He answered on the first ring, his voice professional and alert. I told him I was watching the feed. I told him the family was fracturing. I told him the creditors were at the door. I stared at the image of Preston cowering behind Nia as the front door began to splinter under the force of the blows outside. I looked at Becky trying to climb out the back window, abandoning her husband. I looked at the house Etta and I had built with love, now filled with hate and fear. I gave the order. I told Rothstein to initiate Phase 2. I told him to execute the total foreclosure on the brownstone immediately. I told him to call the police not to save them, but to evict them for trespassing on trust property. I told him to release the liens on Dante's debts to the collection agencies. I told him to unleash the full weight of the law upon them. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair. The show was entering its final act. I watched the screen as the front door gave way. I did not look away. I drank my wine and let the darkness take them. The fluorescent lights of the city register's office hummed with a sterile indifference that matched the cold marble floors. Dante and Naya stood at the counter, their shoulders hunched, looking like two thieves trying to fence a stolen watch. They were desperate. The loan sharks had given Dante 24 hours before they returned to the brownstone with more than just fists, and Preston had given Nia an ultimatum to fix the financial mess or get out. They had come to sell the only thing they thought they had left. The house. They did not care that they had smashed the interior to pieces only hours before. They were selling the land, the shell, the dirt my wife and I had tended for decades. They had a predatory cash buyer lined up, a developer who bought distressed properties, no questions asked, provided the title was clear. Dante slid the paperwork across the scratched laminate counter. His hand was shaking so badly the paper rattled. The document was a forgery, a rushed quitclaim deed he had fabricated using the signature he had practiced copying since high school. He was trying to transfer the title from my name to his own so he could flip it immediately. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, flashing a charming smile at the clerk that looked more like a rictus of pain. Nia stood beside him, her face bruised from her husband's slap, clutching her purse as if it contained the antidote to her ruined life. They were betting everything on this bureaucracy being slow and stupid. They were betting that no one would check the fine print. They were wrong. I had flagged the property in the system the moment I signed the trust documents 10 years ago. They were not walking into a sale. They were walking into a steel trap I had armed before they even knew what greed was. The clerk was a woman named Brenda, who had worked at the registry for 30 years and had seen every scam in the book. She adjusted her spectacles and pulled the file. She typed the block and lot number into her terminal. The keys clacked loudly in the silent room. Dante tapped his fingers on the counter, the sound echoing like a ticking bomb. He asked her to hurry. He told her it was a medical emergency and they needed to liquidate the asset for their sick father. He used my life, the life he had tried to extinguish, as a bargaining chip for a rush job. Brenda stopped typing. She frowned at the screen. She looked at the paper Dante had given her and then back at the monitor. She pushed her glasses up her nose and looked at Dante with eyes that held zero sympathy. She told him there was a problem. Dante leaned in, his aggression spiking. He asked what the problem was. He demanded she process the transfer. Brenda did not flinch. She slid the forged deed back toward him with 2 fingers. She told him that Bernard Payne did not own the property. She told him that Bernard Payne had not owned the property for a decade. Dante froze. He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. He told her she was mistaken. He said he grew up in that house. He said his father had lived there until yesterday. Brenda shook her head. She turned the monitor slightly so they could see. She pointed to the line on the screen that detailed the ownership history. She told them the legal owner of the brownstone was the Etta Payne Revocable Trust. She explained that the property had been transferred into the trust 10 years prior, shortly before Etta passed away. She explained that I, Bernard Payne, was merely the lifetime beneficiary with right of usage, but I did not hold the title to sell. And since I did not hold the title, Dante could not steal it from me. The name of their mother hit them like a physical blow. Dante stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He screamed that it was a lie. He shouted that his mother was a housewife who clipped coupons. He yelled that she had no money. He slammed his fist on the counter and demanded to know what kind of trust it was. He screamed that the old woman had nothing but a Bible and a savings bond. The security guard in the corner stood up, his hand resting on his belt. Brenda remained calm. She tapped a few more keys. She told him that since he was attempting to execute a transaction on the property, she was required to disclose the lien status. She told him there were no liens. She told him the trust was fully solvent. Dante demanded to know the value. He demanded to know what else was in this trust that he had never heard of. He was not grieving his mother. He was calculating what he had missed. Brenda looked at the file. She hesitated for a moment, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of a desire to see the look on his face. She read the list. She told them the trust held the deed to the brownstone free and clear. She told them it also held the deeds to 15 mixed-use commercial buildings in the downtown district. She listed the addresses. They were prime locations. Banks, luxury retail spaces, office towers. She told them the estimated asset value of the Etta Payne Trust was north of $10 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a universe imploding. Nia let out a sound that was half whimper, half scream. Her knees gave way. She did not stumble. She collapsed. She slid down the front of the counter and hit the floor in a heap of expensive fabric and ruined dreams. She had married a monster for money. She had watched her husband hit her father for money. She had betrayed her blood for money. And all along, the money she sold her soul for was sitting in a file cabinet under her mother's name, waiting for children who were good enough to receive it. Dante looked down at his sister, then at the clerk, then at his trembling hands. He realized in that moment that he had not just lost a house, he had lost an empire. He had burned down the kingdom to steal a brick, and now he was left holding nothing but ash. The heavy cream envelopes arrived by private courier at the cramped apartment where my children were currently hiding from their debts. Inside, embossed in gold leaf on thick cardstock, was an invitation to the living will disclosure of Bernard Payne to be held at the most exclusive hotel in the city. To Dante, Nia, and their spouses, this piece of paper was not just an invitation, it was a surrender treaty. They looked at the expensive stationery and convinced themselves that I had finally broken. They believed that the revelation of the trust fund at the registry office had been my way of showing them the prize before handing it over. They convinced themselves that I was a lonely old man who was trying to buy back his family. They arrived at the hotel suite at 7 o'clock sharp, dressed in the last of their finery that hadn't been sold or ruined. Dante wore a suit he had likely retrieved from the dry cleaner he couldn't afford to pay, his eyes darting around the gilded foyer, calculating the cost of the crystal chandeliers. Becky wore the emerald earrings she had hidden from the pawn shop, clutching Dante's arm, her face painted in a mask of rehearsed humility. Nia and Preston walked in with their heads held high, their arrogance reassembled with fragile glue. They whispered to each other, smiling with relief. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought Dad had come to his senses. They sat at the long mahogany table, their eyes hungry not for the food but for the pen that would sign the $10 million over to them. They were ready to forgive me for being rich. The double doors at the far end of the room swung open. I did not limp. I did not shuffle. I walked into the room with the stride of a man who owns the ground beneath his feet. I was not wearing the stained gray jacket from the wedding. I was wearing a bespoke navy Tom Ford suit cut to perfection to fit my broad shoulders. A silk pocket square was folded with geometric precision in my breast pocket. On my wrists I wore the gold cufflinks Etta had given me 40 years ago, polished until they gleamed like small suns. I did not look like a retired sanitation worker. I did not look like a confused pensioner. I looked like the CEO of the empire I had secretly built. The silence in the room was instant and absolute. My children stared at me, their mouths slightly open, struggling to reconcile the father they had thrown away with the titan standing before them. I walked past them. The air shifted as I moved, carrying the scent of authority. I did not look at Dante. I did not look at Nia. I walked straight to the head of the table and sat in the high-backed leather chair that resembled a throne. I placed my hands on the polished wood, intertwining my fingers. They waited for me to speak. They waited for me to say I loved them. They waited for me to say I forgave them. I said nothing. I simply raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The lights in the ballroom dimmed instantly. A massive projection screen descended from the ceiling behind me, humming softly. My family turned in their chairs, confusion rippling through them. The projector beamed to life. The first image was grainy but unmistakable. It was the interior of Dante's Lexus. The audio boomed through the surround sound speakers, crystal clear. Becky's voice filled the room, sharp and hateful, complaining about the smell of my house, talking about using the sale of my home to pay for her plastic surgery. Dante's voice followed, calling me a filthy old man, laughing about cutting Nia out of the inheritance. Nia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, looking at her brother with shock. But the video cut. The next scene was high definition. It was the living room of the brownstone. It showed me lying on the floor, clutching my chest in a feigned heart attack. It showed Preston grabbing Nia's hand, physically stopping her from dialing 911. It showed him calculating the cost of my survival versus the profit of my death. It showed Dante rifling through my pockets like a ghoul stealing the keys from his dying father. The room was filled with the amplified sounds of their own cruelty. The video ended on a freeze frame of Dante's terrified face when I opened my eyes. The screen went black. The light slammed back on brighter than before, exposing them like insects under a microscope. My children were frozen in horror, shrinking into their seats, but they were not the only ones watching. I gestured to the back of the room where the shadows had hidden the other guests. The chairs turned, Dante screamed. Sitting in the back row were 3 men in cheap leather jackets, the loan sharks he owed $50,000 to. They were looking at him with very interested expressions. Next to them sat 2 uniformed police officers and a detective holding notepads. And on the other side sat the board of investors for Preston's gym franchise men he had lied to about his liquidity. They were all watching. They had seen everything. I looked at my children. I told them this was not a dinner. I told them this was an arraignment. Mr. Rothstein stood at the head of the table, adjusting his spectacles with the deliberate slowness of a man who controls the tempo of the room. He opened the leather portfolio that lay before him, and the sound of the stiff paper turning echoed like a thunderclap in the silent suite. My children and their spouses leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the document as if it were a religious text. They were waiting for the numbers. They were waiting for the payout. They were waiting for the moment their greed would finally be validated. But Mr. Rothstein did not read a list of assets. He read a letter. He cleared his throat and began to recite the final codicil of Etta Payne's living trust, dated 2 weeks before her death. The words were my wife's, but the voice was the law's. He read that the entirety of the $10 million estate accumulated from her investments was indeed intended for her children, Dante and Nia. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Preston smirked. Becky gripped Dante's hand. They thought they had won. But Mr. Rothstein raised a finger, silencing them. He continued reading. He stated that the inheritance was subject to a single, non-negotiable condition. The beneficiaries were required to demonstrate a standard of moral integrity and filial piety for a period of 1 year following her passing. They were required to show that they valued family over finance. They were required to treat their surviving father with respect and care. If they failed this condition, the trust stipulated that the entire fortune would bypass them completely and be irrevocably transferred to a charitable cause of the trustees' choosing. Mr. Rothstein lowered the paper and looked at them over the rim of his glasses. He told them that the trustee was me. He told them that I had been the sole judge of their character for the last decade. The smiles vanished from their faces. The air in the room turned ice cold. They realized that the money had never been theirs to take. It had been theirs to earn, and they had been failing the test every single day since Etta died. I stood up slowly, placing my hands on the polished mahogany table. I looked at Dante, whose face had turned the color of ash. I looked at Nia, who was trembling in her seat. I told them the truth. I told them they had failed the test 9 years ago. I told them they failed the moment they let their mother die of a broken heart because of their thievery. I told them they failed when they stopped calling. I told them they failed when they treated me like a nuisance. But I loved them. I was their father. So I extended the deadline. I gave them 9 extra years to find their way back to decency. I gave them 9 years to apologize. I gave them 9 years to show me a single act of kindness that did not have a price tag attached to it. I watched them. I waited. I hoped. But instead of getting better, they got worse. They curdled. I looked at Preston and Becky. I told them that they were the final nails in the coffin of this family. Then I focused on the events of the last week. I reminded them of the wedding. I reminded them of table 17. I reminded them of the velvet curtain they used to hide me because they were ashamed of the man who cleaned up other people's filth so they could have clean hands. I reminded them of the moment I fell to the floor in my living room, clutching my chest, begging for help with my eyes. I reminded them that they did not call an ambulance. I reminded them that they calculated the cost of keeping me alive and decided it was too expensive. I told them that was the moment the clock ran out. I told them that was the moment they signed their own disinheritance. I told them that the father who protected them was gone and only the judge remained. I told them that they had traded $10 million for a quick sale on a brownstone and a funeral they wouldn't even have to pay for. I reached into the inside pocket of my Tom Ford suit and pulled out a fountain pen Etta had given me. It was heavy and gold, and it felt warm in my hand. Mr. Rothstein slid a final document toward me. It was not a check for my children. It was a deed of transfer. The header was bold and clear. It authorized the immediate and total liquidation of the Etta Payne Trust assets. I looked at my children one last time. They were paralyzed. They could not speak. They could not move. They could only watch as I uncapped the pen. I told them where the money was going. I told them it was going to the people who actually needed it. I told them it was going to the children who had nothing but still had the dignity to work for a future. I signed my name, Bernard Payne. The ink flowed smooth and black. With that signature, I transferred $10 million to the scholarship fund for impoverished black children. I created a legacy that would build doctors and lawyers and teachers out of children who knew the value of a dollar. I capped the pen. The sound was final. I pushed the document toward Mr. Rothstein, who notarized it with a stamp that sounded like a gunshot. I looked at Dante and Nia. I told them it was done. I told them the account balance was zero. I told them they had inherited exactly what they deserved, nothing. The room was silent save for the scratching of the pen and the heavy breathing of 4 people whose lives had just been completely emptied. They stared at the paper as if it were a death warrant, and in a way it was. It was the death of their greed. It was the death of their entitlement, and it was the death of their free ride. The ink on the transfer deed was barely dry when the heavy oak doors of the suite burst open again. This time it was not waiters bringing dessert or sommeliers pouring wine. It was a squad of uniformed police officers followed closely by 2 detectives in plain clothes. The air in the room shifted instantly from cold judgment to chaotic reality. Dante stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor, shouting that he had rights. He thought they were there for a noise complaint or a civil dispute. He did not realize they were there for a felony. A detective walked straight to him and slapped a pair of steel cuffs onto his wrists. The sound of the metal locking clicked loudly in the silent room. He read the charges out loud. Identity theft. Forgery of financial instruments. Grand larceny. Dante looked at me, his eyes pleading and wild. He screamed that he was my son. He screamed that it was just a misunderstanding about a loan application. I did not blink. I pointed to the file on the table, the one containing the forensic analysis of his forged signature on the loan shark documents. I told him that stealing his father's name was not a misunderstanding. It was a crime. As they dragged Dante toward the door, Becky tried to slip away. She grabbed her knockoff designer bag and headed for the service exit, her eyes wide with panic. But a female officer stepped in her path. She asked Becky to open the bag. Becky turned pale. She clutched the purse to her chest, refusing to let go. The officer took it from her with professional force. Inside, wrapped in a silk scarf, were several bags of illegal prescription narcotics. Becky had been desperate. She needed money for the plastic surgery she felt she was owed, and when the house sale failed, she turned to smuggling pills for the same loan sharks Dante owed money to. She screamed as they cuffed her. She yelled that she was a victim. She yelled that she was just trying to survive. I watched them haul her away. She wasn't a victim. She was just another greedy soul who thought the laws didn't apply to her. The police cleared the room of my son and his wife, but the show was not over. The 3 men in leather jackets in the back row stood up. They were not police. They were the investors Preston had courted for his imaginary gym empire. They were the men he had dazzled with spreadsheets based on assets that did not exist. Preston backed away from the table, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He stammered. He told them there was a liquidity issue. He told them the funds were tied up in probate. He lied until the very end. The lead investor, a man with a scar over his eye and fists like sledgehammers, did not want to hear excuses. He walked up to Preston and grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. He lifted him off the ground. He asked where the down payment was. He asked why the bank said the collateral was a fraud. Preston pointed at me. He tried to blame the crazy old man. He tried to say I tricked him. The investor didn't look at me. He threw Preston against the wall. A vase crashed to the floor. The facade of the wealthy businessman shattered along with the porcelain. Preston curled into a ball, shielding his face. He was no longer the arrogant son-in-law who laughed at my $5,000 gift. He was a fraud who had been caught. The investors dragged him out of the suite, not to a police car, but to the elevator. They had their own way of settling debts. I watched him go. I did not call security. I did not intervene. Preston had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and gravity had finally come to collect. The room was suddenly quiet, save for the soft sobbing of the only person left. Naya. She sat alone at the long table, surrounded by empty chairs and the wreckage of her family. She looked at the door where her husband had been dragged out. She looked at the spot where her brother had been arrested. Then she looked at me. She slid off her chair. She fell to her knees on the plush carpet. She crawled toward me, her expensive dress bunching around her legs. She grabbed my hand, her tears wetting my knuckles. She begged. She told me she didn't know. She told me Preston forced her. She said she was scared. She said she was just a wife trying to support her husband. She used every excuse in the book to wash her hands of the guilt. She looked up at me with big wet eyes, the same eyes that used to look at me with adoration when she was 5. "Daddy," she whispered.
Please help me. I made a mistake. I was weak. I looked down at her. I searched my heart for the familiar warmth of fatherhood. I looked for the urge to pick her up and tell her it would be okay. I searched for the love that had driven me to work double shifts and skip meals, but I found nothing. The well was dry. I didn't see my little girl. I saw a woman who watched her husband slap her father and did nothing. I saw a woman who was ashamed of my skin, my job, and my life. I saw a stranger. I pulled my hand away from her grip. I told her she wasn't wrong because she listened to her husband. I told her she was wrong because she forgot who her mother was. I told her she forgot who I was. I told her she forgot where she came from. I told her that she had traded her dignity for a penthouse and her soul for a country club membership. I told her I could not save her from the life she had chosen. I stood up. I turned my back on her weeping form. I signaled to Mr. Rothstein it was time to go. Nia clung to my leg with the desperation of a drowning woman anchoring herself to a sinking ship. Her fingernails dug into the fabric of my trousers, dragging against the fine wool as she sobbed into the leather of my shoes. She begged me to look at her. She begged me to remember the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders and watch the parade. But I did look at her. I looked down at the crown of her head, at the hair she had chemically straightened and lightened, until it barely resembled the texture she was born with. I reached down. My hands, the hands that had carried trash cans and signed million-dollar contracts, were steady. I gripped her wrists. I did not squeeze with anger. I squeezed with the firm, unyielding pressure of separation. I peeled her fingers off my leg one by one. She resisted crying out, but she had no strength left. I stepped back, putting a physical distance between us that matched the emotional chasm she had created years ago. I looked her in the eye. I needed her to hear this. I told her that her mistake was not submitting to a domineering husband. That would have been a weakness I could forgive. I told her that her sin was erasure. I told her that she had looked in the mirror every day for 10 years and systematically tried to scrub away the woman her mother raised. I told her she had forgotten who Etta was. I told her she had forgotten who I was. I told her she had forgotten the color of her own skin and the history that ran through her blood because it was inconvenient for her social climbing. "You wanted to be one of them," I said, my voice echoing in the empty room. "You wanted to be a Sterling so badly that you treated the pains like dirt. Well, you got your wish. You are a Sterling now. You have their debts. You have their shame. You have their ruin. I cannot save you from the life you purchased with your soul." I turned my back on her. She screamed my name, a raw, tearing sound that might have broken me yesterday. Today it was just noise. I walked toward the double doors. I did not look back at the daughter I had lost. I looked forward to the man I was finally allowed to be. I pushed through the heavy doors of the hotel and stepped out into the evening air. A light rain had begun to fall, a mist that settled over the city like a cooling balm. It washed the dust of the day from the streets. The doorman, seeing my Tom Ford suit and the way I carried myself, did not point me toward the service entrance. He bowed his head respectfully and moved to open a large black umbrella. I waved him off. I pulled my own umbrella from my side, a sturdy black canopy that snapped open with a sound like a raven taking flight. I stepped out from under the awning. The rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the fabric above my head. Behind me, the muffled sounds of chaos were still drifting from the ballroom. Nia's wails mixing with the shouting of the investors dragging Preston into the elevator. I did not pause. I did not. I walked down the red carpet with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has nowhere to be but exactly where he is. A sleek, black Bentley Mulsanne pulled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the city lights like a dark mirror. This was not a rental. This was mine. It was one of the few luxuries I had allowed the trust to purchase, a vehicle befitting the chairman of a shadow empire. The driver, a large man who used to work security for me back in the sanitation days, stepped out and opened the rear door. I collapsed the umbrella and slid into the leather interior. The door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, sealing out the noise, the rain, and the past.
I watched through the tinted glass as the hotel entrance receded. I saw the police cars flashing blue and red lights against the stone facade. I saw the ambulance arriving for the shock and the panic. I leaned my head back against the headrest. I did not feel guilt. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a profound, quiet lightness. The weight of the secret was gone. The weight of the lie was gone. I was just Bernard Payne, and for the first time in a decade, I was going home to a place that actually felt like one. The penthouse was quiet when I arrived. The city lights spread out below me, a grid of gold and white diamonds stretching to the horizon. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the antique writing desk that faced the window. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the burgundy diary. Etta's diary. The leather was warm from being close to my heart. I opened it to the last page, the page where I had promised her I would wait. I picked up a red ink pen. I did not hesitate. I drew a single clean line through the name Dante. I drew a single clean line through the name Nia. I did not scribble. I did not tear the paper. I simply crossed them out, removing them from the narrative of our legacy. Below their names on the fresh white space of the paper, I wrote 2 words. Start over. I closed the book. I looked at the reflection of my face in the darkened window. I saw an old man, yes. I saw the lines of grief and hard work etched into my skin. But I also saw strength. I saw the man Etta had loved. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I would walk into the community center in the Bronx. I would meet 3 young students, brilliant children from neighborhoods just like the one I grew up in. Children who had grades but no money. Children who had dreams but no path. I would look them in the eye. I would shake their hands. And I would tell them that their tuition was paid in full. I would tell them that Etta Payne believed in them. I would build a new family, not of blood, but of shared hope and gratitude. I sat there in the silence of my high tower alone, but not lonely. A sense of complete serenity washed over me. The war was over. The rebuilding had begun. And as I looked out at the city that had tried to break me, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. I was finally free. I spent 40 years believing that my worth was tied to how much I could provide, but I learned the hard way that provision without respect only breeds entitlement. True wealth is not the balance in a bank account or the cut of a suit. It is the peace that comes from knowing you never have to compromise your dignity to be loved. We are often told that blood is thicker than water, but I found that loyalty is the only bond that truly matters. You cannot save people who are determined to drown in their own greed, and you should never set yourself on fire just to keep ungrateful people warm. If you agree that respect is earned and not inherited, please hit that like button and tell me in the comments, would you have given them one last chance or did they get exactly what they deserved?